really matters? That might be the most important question you can ask. So let's talk about it. Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thank you so much for tuning in today and joining me here. Today I have a very interesting topic, something that I've been working on over the last couple of weeks, which is the topic of trauma, childhood trauma for one, and also ancestral trauma that we inherit through our lineage here on planet Earth. And I think this is going to take me at least 2 episodes to talk about this, possibly even more, because I'm learning so much, I'm gathering so much information. And one thing that triggered all of this investigation is I'm preparing a talk to give on suicide, which I'll be doing later this week. And once again, I was looking back at my father's suicide and his history, and it was very apparent to me in looking through all the information I have, at least, about my father's childhood and his life and being in World War II, that trauma played a major role in my father's later suicide in life. And I got inspired to start reading the book The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel Kolk, which I'd heard about for several years now, but I had never read before. And he writes very eloquently about trauma, which he has studied throughout his entire career as a psychiatrist. And that book touched me in so many ways on so many levels. And I found myself teary-eyed much of the time while reading it as I looked back at my father's life and the stories I knew of his life and things that had happened to him. I could see how, as an adult, he was affected in so many ways, his behavior, because of the trauma he endured earlier in life. But I also began to see how I, in turn, received some of that trauma as well. And I could see the same thing for my mom and the trauma she endured as a child growing up in an abusive family. But I began to recognize that I literally inherited some of my parents' trauma. I took it on, and I not only inherited it genetically, which we will talk about later when we get to ancestral trauma, but that at times I was traumatized by my own parents and their behavior toward me, by them just doing the best they could, being who they were. Some of the trauma that I began to carry with me in my own shadow, and how that trauma influenced my development and how I grew and who I became as an adult. And I am able to see all these threads of trauma throughout my life and the influence that they had on me. And I decided this is such an important topic that I really want to discuss it here on the podcast, to share this information with you. But first of all, I really encourage you to read The Body Keeps the Score. Let me read The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma, Dr. Bessel Kolk. I'm not finished with the book yet, but I'll probably be finishing it in the next couple of days. And I thought at least I could get started talking about this subject now, and then follow up next week with more things that I learned from the remainder of the book. And it's interesting because a number of years ago, I guess now it was about 12 years ago, when I first retired from medical practice and started writing books, I got inspired to create an online course on healing the hidden wounds of childhood. And I looked back at some notes I had made when my children were younger on the developmental stages of childhood, and I saw how important parents are for the successful completion of each stage of childhood, and how every one of us in some ways has experienced some sort of wounding during our childhoods as we grow up, because no parents are perfect. And even those of us who were not physically or emotionally abused or sexually abused during our childhoods have obtained wounds because our parents weren't perfect. They weren't able to always meet our needs in the best way possible as we were growing up. And looking back at the developmental stages of childhood and the needs of the child made it really clear to me that for every child there are certain needs that didn't get met in the best possible way, and created small hidden wounds for that child. And when we look at ourselves and our own development in that way, we can actually trace those threads, as I was mentioning, that I can see now about myself. We can trace them throughout life. We can see how little events that happened in childhood, not just from our parents, but things that may have happened to us at school or from other children or other adults, and how they treated us or interacted with us. Those small events can cause little wounds in our psyche that persist into adulthood that sometimes are very hard to heal because we simply don't remember them or we're not very aware of them. And so I began to look at life from this perspective. When I was in medical practice, I actually did this with a lot of my patients. I had them create a timeline of their childhood from birth on and write about any significant events that happened to them or within their family. And nearly everyone that did this said, oh, in this year, my parents told me my dad lost his job and we were really financially strapped and there wasn't enough food to eat some days at home, and there was a lot of worry and stress over my dad's job. Or other people would say, oh, my mom got diagnosed with a serious illness and was in the hospital off and on for a couple of years. So there were many times when the kids were left home while dad was at work and mom was too sick to take care of them. And so the oldest child had to step in and take care of the younger ones. There were all kinds of stories like this when people began to research their own life history. They could look back and see many times when there were stressors, unusual stressors perhaps, but stress that came just from the events of life, from life happening and the way things unfolded in each family. But when we began to trace back for each individual, how old were you when this event took place? And what stage were you at in your development? And what needs of yours possibly went unmet or were not well met during that phase of your life, and how did that create a wound? So the interesting thing is we were able to begin to trace certain things through into adulthood for each person as they identified these situations. And just for me personally, one thing I identified is that I was hospitalized at the age of 9 months, which is an age for the developing infant when stranger anxiety is at its peak, meaning the child has become aware of parents as the safe people in its world, and strangers are rather terrifying, and the child feels insecure. But here at 9 months, I became ill, and I was hospitalized for 2 or 3 days and away from my parents. And so suddenly it seemed obvious to me that there was a certain amount of trauma that as a 9-month-old I experienced. And when I looked back at that, I could see how that may have led to other things that happened later. For instance, I was delayed in walking, and the pediatrician couldn't find any physical reason why I wasn't walking. It appeared that I should be able to walk, but I refused to walk. And the link appeared for me when I looked at that, well, I was afraid. I'd been traumatized by being away from my mother in the hospital when I was younger. And I had a fear of leaving my mother, and walking meant walking away from her. And I needed to just stay next to her, clinging to her, because I was afraid. And so I carried with me this anxiety and fear throughout childhood and into adolescence and on into my adulthood, except it was always a vague anxiety. I never understood it. And it would come up at odd times. I would suddenly feel very anxious and frightened and alone in the world. I couldn't put my finger on it. Where did that come from? I never had any explanation for that feeling until I did this work and looked back at my early childhood, when I became aware of that hospitalization and began to put the whole picture together. It made so much sense to me. And here's what happened as a result of that. I was able to spend some time kind of in contemplation and meditation and really thinking back like, oh, I still have within me this imprint of a 9-month-old child who's in a hospital and terrified of all these strangers who are drawing blood and doing tests, and I have no idea what's going on, and I don't feel safe, and I'm afraid. And so I was able to just really connect with that fearful part of myself, fearful from such an early age that it doesn't really, there are no words in some ways to describe it. But I was able gradually to get in touch with that part of me and to soothe that frightened part of me, and to really bring my higher self, my love, my wisdom, my knowledge, my current feeling of safety in the world, to really bring those higher concepts into that place of fear. And it was incredible. I was able to make huge strides in healing that very, very early wound. And it reduced my anxiety to an amazing degree. I mean, I don't have those experiences anymore of having just vague, random feelings of anxiety come over me. I don't experience it anymore since I did that work. So because of the power of that, I created an online course called Healing the Hidden Wounds of Childhood. That was my first experience with this concept of carrying wounds inside that need to be healed, and that we can change our lives right now today if we do that work on ourselves. And all of that was totally validated by Bessel Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. So for me, that work I did in the past on anxiety was really transformative. And I know now that I need to do more work. I have more wounds that I'm aware of after reading this book. But I realized I need to share that with you. I need to talk about that, because I believe all of us need to do this. I believe all of us need to really search back into the past and not be afraid of the memories that we will find there, and not be afraid of any pain or anxiety that comes up, because we will change ourselves if we begin to heal those old wounds, but we can also change the world around us by healing whatever it is that we are carrying with us. So as we get started, I wanted to mention the ACE study, and I'm not sure if I've talked about that before on this podcast, but ACE, ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this was a really powerful study done by the CDC and Kaiser Health. They looked at adults who had a whole variety of chronic illnesses, and then did surveys of those adults to find out if any of them had certain adverse childhood experiences in their past. And they found a striking correlation between the adverse experiences and the current history of lots of different chronic illnesses. I'll give you some of these, a quote from Bessel Kolk, because he talks about this study as well. But so first of all, the areas they were looking at as far as history were any history of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, any history of physical or emotional neglect, and any history of family dysfunction, which includes domestic violence, substance abuse in the family, marital discord, mental illness in a family member, or crime. So those were the areas they looked at in their survey of adults. And in the survey, you receive 1 point for any type of abuse, neglect, or family dysfunction you have had. And so you indicate all of them, whatever that number may be, and then add up the score. And they found that having had even one adverse childhood experience would correlate with some sort of health issues in adulthood. But the more adverse experiences you have had, the much greater the likelihood or the risk of having certain illnesses and experiences in adulthood. And so here's a quote about the ACE study from Bessel van der Kolk from his book. As the ACE study has shown, child abuse and neglect is the single most preventable cause of mental illness, the single most common cause of drug and alcohol abuse, and a significant contributor to leading causes of death such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer, stroke, and suicide. And so, as he's saying, it's fascinating, but these adverse childhood experiences are actually one of the most common causes of these serious, chronic, physical, mental, and emotional illnesses that we experience in adulthood. And yet, Western medicine has actually failed to recognize the significance of this sort of trauma that takes place in childhood. I learned from Dr. van der Kolk's book that studies of non-drug treatments for these illnesses are rarely funded. And he says mainstream medicine is firmly committed to a better life through chemistry. And the fact that we can actually change our own physiology and inner equilibrium by means other than drugs is rarely considered. So what he's describing here is that unfortunately in our medical system, the history of trauma largely gets ignored. And patients who may be carrying deep, intense wounds that could be healed if they were properly addressed are being given pharmaceutical agents. And it could be everything from drugs for hypertension and diabetes, drugs for depression and anxiety, and drugs for bipolar disorder, and on, endless numbers of drugs are actually being given drugs that cover up the symptoms, that make them numb, that make it even harder for them to go within and do the work of looking at the wounds they have within, and actually keep them stuck in a place where they are living out over and over again this traumatic past that they experienced, and it's coming out in the form of physical, mental, and emotional illness. So the situation is that trauma is not really addressed within our medical system. Most people are never asked questions about any kind of trauma they might have experienced earlier in life, let alone the type of hidden wounds that I was talking about that I created my course for. None of those are getting addressed. And so people don't realize they are carrying within them these wounds that are hidden away that could actually be healed if they were brought to the surface, and that might change everything about their physical health. And I'll share another quote from the book, which says, "We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think." And he's saying that when we experience trauma, particularly in earlier life, Our brain responds by creating a defense system, by putting up walls, sometimes to wall off the memory of that pain, by shifting synapses and how information is carried throughout the brain in order to protect us from further damage from the memory of that trauma. And these defenses help us survive when we're little, but they end up causing problems for us as we reach adulthood because they keep us stuck at whatever age we were when we were traumatized. Parts of us are still stuck at that very age and not able to keep growing and developing. And so we reach adulthood not being whole, not being all of who we are, because we have little parts and pieces and threads of ourselves that are trapped in the past by these traumatic memories that are being stored and hidden away for our protection, but protection that ideally we wouldn't need. Now, if we're carrying enough trauma within us that it has resulted in physical illness, we're quite likely to end up being on medications, and oftentimes here in our country, a number of different medications for this physical expression of the trauma that is taking place within us. Now, not all illness comes from trauma in childhood, and yet it could be a contributor to one degree or another to all illness. And so we don't want to forego the medical treatments and the pharmaceuticals completely because they still may be needed. But if we are not aware of the impact of trauma and we never look at it, we're missing a huge component, a huge underlying foundational component of our physical, mental, and emotional illnesses that can actually be healed, that could actually be made better. We could actually be restored to greater wholeness. Perhaps we wouldn't need the medications and treatments that we're being given by the medical system. Now, everything that I'm talking about right now, as Dr. van der Kolk emphasizes in his book, is considered alternative and fringe within the medical system, which is why doctors don't ask about it, don't talk about it. Studies are not done as often as they should be, though Dr. van der Kolk has done a lot of studies, which you can read about in his book. And I also want to mention a helpful analogy that Dr. van der Kolk uses when he talks about the impact of trauma on us. It creates a compartmentalization, in a sense, in the brain where certain portions of the brain don't have access to one another. They can't communicate well or work together well. And he likens it to a rider riding a horse, and the horse represents the more primitive reptilian part of the brain. The rider is our frontal cortex, our higher awareness, and cognitive awareness of what's happening in our lives. And so we have this rider on a horse, and the horse is somewhat wild and hasn't been well tamed. And so from time to time, the horse will take off and buck and run and be reckless and sometimes completely buck off the rider. There's no one to control the horse. So our reptilian brain, where all of our emotions are stored, can go wild at times, can go rogue. Our emotions suddenly erupt from us and we're angry and upset about something. We may completely lose it and go into a rage, and we don't know why. We can't explain why one simple little thing caused such a serious reaction to happen. We don't know. We don't know what set that off. The reason is because there's a hidden wound there. There's a hidden wound that is keeping the more primitive part of the brain in a wild state instead of allowing the rider to take control over the horse, instead of allowing our cognitive awareness, our higher self, to have control over the horse. So Dr. van der Kolk was saying in his book, you can approach this issue in two ways. One is to train the rider to have better skills at managing this wild horse. And you can do that through mindfulness meditation and increasing awareness, doing journaling, talking about the trauma like we are today, these cognitive approaches to helping the rider understand what's going on with this horse. Why is this horse so wild, and how can I control it better? But you can also treat it by working with the horse, soothing the horse and training the horse so that the horse itself is less wild. And to do that, you need more physical modalities like doing yoga or Pilates, perhaps, or some other type of body therapy, Reiki. He also suggests movement like dance and using drumming or music, because those penetrate and connect with our more primitive brain. And we can learn how to soothe this wild horse that is leading us astray and bucking us off and causing all sorts of havoc in our lives when we use those physical modalities to help train the horse. And so obviously we need to be doing both. We need to approach our traumatized selves from both aspects. We need to be mindful and aware. We need to be getting insights and writing in our journals and really looking at ourselves, studying the timeline of our childhood, perhaps thinking back and asking questions about things that happened earlier in life, but then also doing body-focused exercises and movement that will help us soothe that wild, more primitive part of the brain. And in that way, we can begin to relax a little bit. And the more work we do, the more we'll be able to remember these experiences. The more they can come to the surface, the more we'll be able to start healing them. So I'll read another quote from the book. The challenge of recovery is to reestablish ownership of your body and your mind, of yourself. This means feeling free to know what you know and to feel what you feel without becoming overwhelmed, enraged, ashamed, or collapsed. For most people, this involves, number one, finding a way to become calm and focused. Number two, learning to maintain that calm in response to images, thoughts, sounds, or physical sensations that remind you of the past. Number three, finding a way to be fully alive in the present and engaged with the people around you. And number four, not having to keep secrets from yourself, including secrets about the ways that you managed to survive. And so this is so powerful, and I love it. I'm going to keep coming back to these four things. These are the four steps of recovery, really. Becoming calm and focused, maintaining the calm regardless of what's happening around us, becoming fully alive in the present moment and engaging with the people around us, and not keeping secrets from ourselves. In other words, not keeping hidden the pain or the wounds or the trauma of the past that we have been carrying. So really powerful stuff, those four things. And I think we could probably spend several episodes talking about them. I'm really excited about it. But I wanted to just mention to you again the idea of combining some cognitive work like contemplation, doing a timeline of your past, of your childhood, journaling about that, with some physical modalities like yoga, Tai Chi, Pilates, Reiki, any physical body therapy, also drumming, dancing, music, things that help you get in touch with your deep physical self. So I wanted to give you a few things to work on since it'll be a week before I come back and talk about this some more. But you might try looking up the ACE study, ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences study. There's a questionnaire online you can look at if you're interested in checking that out for yourself. And I highly recommend it. I think this will turn out to be as powerful for you as it has been for me. I certainly hope so. I want to thank everyone. I received a lot of messages after my episode number 100 congratulating me, but also many very thoughtful and sweet messages from people telling me what this podcast has meant to them. And that's kind of the information I was curious about or wondering if anyone's actually listening. So I just want to thank all of you who took the time to reach out to me. I appreciate it so very much. I'll be back next week. We'll talk a little more about trauma then. And so until then, remember that we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings you next, and love each and every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.